The galactic convergence had solved faster-than-light travel, mastered quantum entanglement communication, and even cracked the code on sustainable fusion reactors, small enough to power a wristwatch. They had conquered diseases that turned beings inside out, negotiated peace between species that communicated through aggressive mating displays, and built space stations that could house millions while maintaining artificial gravity so precise you could balance a needle on its point for decades. Yet somehow, inexplicably, hilariously, the collected wisdom of 47 different spacefaring civilizations couldn't figure out how to get a decent night's sleep. The epidemic had started subtly, as most disasters do. A Velcrin diplomat nodding off during crucial trade negotiations. A Thessian engineer making a mathematical error that resulted in a cargo bay door opening outward instead of inward, which, in the vacuum of space, created some rather spectacular property damage. A Corvian pilot who fell asleep at the helm and crashed into a moon. Granted, it was a small moon, more of an ambitious asteroid really, but the insurance paperwork alone took 3 months to process. Sleep deprivation was spreading through the stars like a yawn in a board meeting, and the galaxy's finest minds were baffled. The research vessel Perpetual Inquiry served as a floating think tank, designed to tackle the universe's most pressing problems with a crew representing 12 different species. Currently, that pressing problem was why everyone aboard felt like they'd been awake since the heat death of the previous universe. The ship's medical officer, a 4-armed Ichthian named Vex, had tried everything in his considerable pharmacological arsenal. Sedatives left the crew groggy and useless. Sleep-inducing sound frequencies just gave everyone headaches. Meditation programs resulted in 3 separate crew members achieving what they claimed was enlightenment, but which really just meant they sat in corners humming and refused to work. The Velcrin first officer spent his nights in a suspension pod, calibrated to his species' exact comfort specifications, temperature controlled to within 1/10 of a degree, humidity-optimized gentle rocking motion that mimicked their home planet's tidal pools. He still woke up feeling like he'd been trampled by a herd of whatever Velcrin had instead of cattle. The ship's navigator, a crystalline gene whose species technically didn't need sleep, but benefited from a rest cycle anyway, had taken to dimming her luminescence so much she kept bumping into walls. Even the ship's AI had started exhibiting what the programmers awkwardly termed processing fatigue, which meant it occasionally forgot what it was saying mid-sentence and had to start over. Then Command, in either a stroke of genius or bureaucratic desperation, decided to bring in a human. Nobody was particularly excited about this development. Humans were the galactic newcomers, the species that had only recently figured out how to leave their own solar system without something exploding. They were known primarily for their alarming tendency to befriend anything that didn't immediately try to kill them, their bizarre practice of consuming chemical stimulants to wake up and depressants to sleep, and their inexplicable affection for keeping small predators in their homes as pets. The idea that a human could solve a problem that had stumped the galaxy's finest scientific minds seemed, to put it charitably, optimistic. The human arrived on a Tuesday, though several crew members immediately pointed out that Tuesday was an Earth-specific concept and meant nothing in interstellar space. This did not stop the human from insisting it was, in fact, Tuesday. His name was Marcus Webb, and he shambled off the transport shuttle looking exactly how everyone on the Perpetual Inquiry felt: exhausted, rumpled and vaguely annoyed at existence. "Right," Marcus said, dropping his single duffel bag on the deck with a thud that suggested it contained either rocks or an alarming number of books. With humans, it could go either way. "So I hear you lot can't sleep. That's what I'm getting from the briefing, yeah? Galaxy's finest minds, billions of credits in research funding, and you've all forgotten how to pass out for 8 hours. Vex bristled, which was impressive given his species didn't have hair. We have attempted 147 different interventions. Our approach has been rigorous, scientific, and unsuccessful, Marcus finished, scratching his jaw. Yeah, I read the reports. Very thorough documentation of failure. That could wallpaper a space station with all the charts about how rubbish everyone's sleeping. He looked around the docking bay, eyes sharp despite his slovenly appearance. Right then, show me where you're all trying to sleep. What followed was a tour that would have been educational if it weren't so depressing. The Velcrin First Officer's suspension pod looked like something from a luxury spa, all sleek lines and glowing controls. The Thessian crew quarters featured beds that adjusted firmness in real time based on body position. The Corvians had hammered out sleeping platforms that vibrated at their species' preferred frequency. Every accommodation was precisely engineered, scientifically optimized, and clearly not working worth a damn. Marcus walked through the crew quarters with his hands in his pockets, occasionally poking at a control panel or lying down on someone's bed to test it. The crew followed in a nervous cluster, uncertain whether to be offended or hopeful. "See, here's your problem," Marcus announced, standing in the middle of the communal sleeping area. "You've all made sleeping complicated. You've got pods and platforms and suspension fields and Christ knows what else. And you're all still staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning wondering why your brains won't shut off." "Our sleeping arrangements are optimized for," began the Thessian engineer. "Yeah, optimized, I heard. Everything's optimized. You've optimized yourselves into insomnia." Marcus pulled out a small tablet and started sketching something. "Right. First thing, who here uses their data terminal before sleep?" Every appendage in the room went up. Some species had multiple appendages, which made the forest of raised limbs even more impressive. Marcus closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Of course you do. Why would you not stare at glowing screens that blast your optical receptors with blue light and activate your stress responses right before trying to sleep? That's just brilliant. That is. But we need to check communications, monitor systems, review reports," protested one of the Corvians. "No, you need to sleep. The reports will still be there in the morning, and they'll probably still be boring." Marcus started gathering materials from a storage locker, fabric, rope, some metal clips. "Right, hammocks first, then we're talking about your screen addiction." The concept of a hammock had to be explained 3 times. The idea that one would voluntarily suspend oneself in fabric, unsupported by any rigid structure, seemed to violate several species' fundamental understanding of physics and common sense. The Velcrin First Officer stared at Marcus's rough sketch like it was a diagram for a bomb. "You want us to hang?" Vex asked slowly, as if testing whether he'd translated the word correctly. "Yeah, hang, like fruit, or bats, or anyone with sense who's stuck sleeping in a warm climate." Marcus was already tying knots with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "See, you lot are all sleeping on surfaces that don't move, don't breathe, don't conform to your body. You're fighting against your beds instead of working with them. Our beds are scientifically designed to optimize." "Yeah, you mentioned. How's that working out?" Marcus finished the first hammock and strung it between 2 support beams. It hung there, swaying gently, looking absolutely ridiculous in the middle of the high-tech sleeping quarters. "Right. Who's brave enough to try the primitive human sleep technology?" Nobody moved. The crew exchanged glances, each hoping someone else would volunteer to be the test subject. Finally, one of the Thessians, a junior researcher, whose name translated to something like bright ember of curiosity, but who went by Ember, stepped forward. "I will attempt this hammock." Ember's first 3 attempts to get into the hammock resulted in immediate ejection from the other side, which would have been funnier if the Thessian hadn't smacked into a wall locker each time. Marcus provided patient instruction, demonstrating the proper diagonal lying position, and eventually Ember settled into the fabric cocoon with a look of profound confusion. "This is unexpected," Ember said, swaying gently. "The pressure distribution is remarkably even, and the motion is not unpleasant." "Give it 20 minutes, Marcus said, already working on a second hammock. "Just lie there. No screens, no work. Just hang about and see what happens." 18 minutes later, Ember was snoring, or doing whatever Thessians did that sounded like a small engine turning over. The other crew members stared in stunned silence. By the end of the week, Marcus had rigged hammocks throughout the ship, turning the crew quarters into something that looked like a very confused spider's web. The transformation was remarkable. Crew members who'd been operating on 3 hours of fitful sleep suddenly found themselves waking naturally after full rest cycles, actually feeling refreshed for the first time in months. The Velcrin first officer abandoned his expensive suspension pod entirely, declaring the hammock primitive yet inexplicably superior. But Marcus wasn't done. The hammocks were just the beginning. "Right. Next problem," he announced during a crew meeting, where several people were noticeably more alert than they'd been in months. "You're all still staring at your screens until you pass out. This ends now." The resistance was immediate and vocal. The crew needed their terminals for vital communications. They had to stay informed. What if there was an emergency? What if they missed something important? What if you actually slept like functional beings instead of zombie versions of yourselves? Marcus countered. "Here's the new rule. 2 hours before sleep, screens go off. All of them. Data terminals, workstations, even those little wrist displays you all love so much." "That's impossible," protested the navigator. "I need to. You need to let your brain realize it's nighttime, or whatever passes for nighttime when you're floating through the void." Marcus was already reprogramming the ship's systems. "I'm setting up automatic dimming protocols. 2 hours before standard sleep cycle, all non-essential screens in the personal quarters dim to minimal output. You want to work? Use the common areas. Want to sleep? Your quarters are now screen-free zones." The rebellion lasted exactly 4 days. The crew members who'd already converted to hammocks combined with screen restrictions reported even better sleep. Those who resisted found themselves increasingly exhausted while watching their colleagues thrive. The holdouts fell like dominoes, each conversion making the next inevitable. But Marcus saved his masterstroke for the morning routine. "You all just wake up and immediately start working," he observed, watching the morning shift change with the eye of an anthropologist studying a particularly dysfunctional tribe. No transition, no warm-up, just consciousness to productivity like flipping a switch. Then you wonder why you're knackered by midday. He introduced coffee. Well, not actual coffee. Getting that through quarantine would have required paperwork that wouldn't be approved until the heat death of the universe. But each species' equivalent stimulant beverage. The trick wasn't the beverage itself, which most species already consumed at some point during their day. The trick was the ritual. You wake up, you don't check your terminal, you don't start working, you sit, you drink your beverage, you ease into consciousness like a sensible being instead of lurching into the day like you're fleeing a predator. Marcus demonstrated in the ship's common area, moving with deliberate slowness that seemed almost defiant in its refusal to hurry. Then, and this is the bit you'll all hate, you stretch. Stretch. The Corvian security chief looked baffled. "Our species maintains flexibility through being tense all the time." "Yeah, I can tell." Marcus started demonstrating basic stretches, movements so simple they seemed almost insulting. 5 minutes. That's all. Wake the body up properly instead of dragging it around like reluctant cargo. The morning routine met even more resistance than the screen restrictions. Stretching seemed frivolous. The beverage ritual felt like wasted time. Everyone had important work that couldn't wait for such nonsense. Then productivity reports started coming in. Crew members following Marcus's complete sleep protocol, hammocks, screen restrictions and morning routines, weren't just sleeping better, they were working better. Fewer errors, faster problem solving, improved creativity. The Thessian engineer who'd been stuck on a propulsion problem for 2 months suddenly cracked it after her first full week of proper sleep and morning stretching. The Velcrin first officer, previously famous for his irritability during morning briefings, became almost pleasant to work with. The ship's AI noticed the changes and started generating reports, because that's what AIs do when something interesting happens. Error rates down 43%. Interdepartmental conflicts reduced by 67%. Overall productivity increased by 38%. And every single measurement correlated directly with adoption of what the crew had started calling the human protocols. Word spread. Other ships heard about the Perpetual Inquiry's transformation. Research stations requested consultations. A Velcrin medical consortium offered Marcus an absurd amount of credits to come explain his methods, which he declined on the grounds that he'd rather not spend 6 months explaining the bleeding obvious to people with 17 PhDs. The galactic scientific community struggled with the implications. Papers were written, studies were conducted, and experts across dozens of fields tried to explain why such simple interventions had succeeded where sophisticated technology failed. The prevailing theory involved something about evolutionary biology and circadian rhythms and the psychological importance of routine, but it mostly boiled down to they'd been overthinking it. Marcus, for his part, found the whole situation hilarious. He'd been brought in as a desperation measure, the galactic equivalent of, well, we've tried everything else, might as well ask the primitive newcomers. And he'd fixed their problem with technology that humans had been using since they lived in caves and hung animal skins between trees. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. 6 months after his arrival, the Perpetual Inquiry had the highest crew satisfaction rating in the fleet. Other ships started installing hammocks. Screen restriction protocols became standard operating procedure across multiple fleets. Morning routines were written into official regulations, which meant somewhere, some bureaucrat had to write formal documentation about the importance of stretching and drinking beverages slowly. The Velcrin first officer found Marcus in his hammock one evening, because of course Marcus slept in a hammock in his own quarters, and thanked him with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "You've transformed this ship. The crew is healthier, happier, more effective. You solved a problem that baffled our finest minds." Marcus cracked one eye open from his comfortable sway. "I taught you lot to lie in fabric and not stare at screens before bed. That's not solving a problem, that's just not being daft. Still, the galaxy owes you a debt. The galaxy can pay me back by getting a decent night's sleep and not making everything so bloody complicated." Marcus closed his eye again. "Now, if you don't mind, I'm demonstrating the efficacy of my protocols, which is a fancy way of saying sod off. I'm tired." The Perpetual Inquiry sailed on through the cosmos, its crew finally resting properly for the first time in collective memory. Behind them spread a growing wave of converted ships, reformed sleep habits, and a grudging acceptance that sometimes the newest voices had the oldest wisdom. Advanced civilizations had spent decades developing sophisticated solutions to sleep deprivation, poured fortunes into research, and built machines of staggering complexity, all to accomplish what humans had figured out shortly after discovering fire and comfortable places to lie down. The galaxy had mastered the stars but forgotten how to close their eyes. It took a tired human with rope, fabric, and the radical notion that maybe bedtime shouldn't involve glowing screens to remind them of what they'd lost in their rush toward progress. In the end, the most advanced sleep technology in the known universe turned out to be a hammock, a schedule, and the revolutionary concept of not being an idiot about rest. Somewhere in the administrative offices of Galactic Command, someone was probably writing a policy paper about it. They were likely doing so late at night, staring at a screen, wondering why they felt so tired. Some lessons apparently took longer to learn than others.